So I guess in your introduction you were trying to say politely, as ich bin geworden a historian, Chof Av Farbrengen. We'll try and share a few stories of the Rebbe's father, but and that's what I was hired for tonight, to share a few stories of the Rebbe's father. But just betur akdama, you know, there's the Yud Aleph Nissen Sichos where the Rebbe begins the Farbrengen, or begins one of the Sichos with this thing that makes all of us uncomfortable, and that is when the Rebbe is saying how uncomfortable he is, that l'chayre das aninim prati, and then he goes on to explain, ich weiß, whatever it is. Usually it's that when Yidden kommen zusammen, das aninim klali, and befrat, we'll chazer in yanim in Torah, and we'll make achlatas, so it's okay that we're having a Farbrengen. It's a lashon that I know many of us are very uncomfortable even hearing the Rebbe speak that way, as though he's apologizing for that there's a Farbrengen, Yud Aleph Nissen. And there's a very similar lashon that you see sometimes on Vav Tishrei and on Chof Av. So just like we know that Yud Aleph Nissen is Chag HaChagim, and for us it's the biggest Yom Tov that there is, somewhere up there above, or whatever it is, Yotes Kislev V'chulu. The same thing with Chof Av. I mean, the Rebbe himself kind of puts it together that these days are similar. The same type of thing that he's telling us. It's a Yom Prati of his. And B'derech Memela, I would like to think that for Chassidim and Mekusharim, these days are the most meaningful days, and the days that we need to think about and to appreciate and to really live during these days more than any other days that there are, because they're days that are specifically connected to the Rebbe very personally. Anyway, so we'll share a few stories as much as there's time for, and yeah, the Rebbe. We'll share a little bit about the Rebbe's father, and depending on how much time we have, we will either expand or compress. The Rebbe's father was born in a small city called Podebranka in Russia, and his mother, Rebbe Zelda Rachel, was the daughter of the Rav of the city, whose name was Reb Zalman Chaikin. I keep making this mistake. I'm sorry. His uncle was the Rav of the city. His name was Reb Yoel Chaikin, and he was also his Melamed. His Zayda was a Gvir in the city, Reb Zalman Chaikin. And just to give you a bit of a picture of who he was, because the Rebbe's father obviously grew up kind of under him, in his shadow, in his home to a certain extent. It's a short story that's told about him, and that is that he was, as a Gvir, he had a big home, and it was a very open home. And Aniyim would be able to come in, and they would eat, and they would be able to sleep there if they wanted. People stayed for weeks, people stayed for months, as long as they wanted, basically. And the way it worked was that the senior Ani would become the kitchen manager. Whoever had seniority and it was there for longest, he would take care of the kitchen. So one Ani moved on, and the next one took his place and became the manager of the kitchen, and he made some rules. First of all, there are certain set times for the meals. Second of all, we don't use the back door, we only come in the front doors. The rules were posted, you know, that all the Aniyim knew. One day, Reb Zalman came home, and he walked in the back door. So this fellow started screaming at him, "What are you doing? Don't you know there are rules here? You have to come in the front door. I'm in charge over here." Obviously, he didn't know that he was the owner of the home, and Reb Zalman apologized and walked in the front door. So, you know, the same way that Rebbe Elkanah speaks about her father, whom the Rebbe grew up under and almost in his home, and that obviously had a tremendous hashpa on the Rebbe as a child. When we go up one generation, we hear about the Rebbe's father. I think this is an interesting story that kind of tells us what he grew up amidst. And it was his uncle, Rabbi Yoel, who was his main melamed as a child. After the Istalkus of the Rebbe's father, the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote a 2-page obituary in Kavitz Lubavitch. At the time, nobody knew that the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote it, but the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote the whole thing. And one of the things that he writes there, it's Yiddish, it's very, very interesting, like what he chooses to highlight and how he speaks about the Rebbe's father. Never mind, the way he starts it is he says that just a couple days ago, it was Noida to Chasna de Benesiya, Harav the Rebbe's name, that his father was the terrible news that his father was nostalgic in Kazakhstan. It's just interesting that the Frierdiker Rebbe is writing how was Noida to Chasna de Benesiya, the Rebbe, about the stalkers of his father. But anyway, one of the things that he writes there, like kind of early on in his life, that from very early on, it was known to everybody about his Kishroinis Iluyim Yoitzim Min HaKlal. Well, one of the big highlights that we always see about him, and that's always spoken about, and that the Rebbe himself was madgish quite a few times, was the fact that he was a tremendous makusher to the Rebbe Rashab. And there was something written in English in Tafshin Nun. Was it in LNS? Yiddishaim, that's right. It was in the Yiddishaim. There's an article about the Rebbe's father, and it says there, he was also active in many areas involving the Jewish community, including participating in meetings called by the Lubavitch Rebbe of that day. The Rebbe Rashab, with whom Horav Levi Yitzchak had very close ties. So the Rebbe crosses out the word, it says he was also active. The Rebbe crosses out the word also and writes very. He was very active. And when it says the Rebbe Rashab, the Rebbe adds, Rebbe Rashab nishmas eiden sharav Levi Yitzchak haya chasidoi hachi masur. He was the most ibergegeben chassid of the Rebbe Rashab. And then when it says he had very close ties, the Rebbe adds the words personal ties. He had very close personal ties. So also another interesting point there that the Frierdiker Rebbe writes, which you see in a number of places. I think it's in the Toldos, in the beginning of Hayom also, that he writes that from Taf Reish Samach Beis he was mishtatif in every meeting of the Rebbe Rashab for Inyanei HaKlal. Taf Reish Samach. It's just a diuk that I would think is kind of every time you see it, it's like, okay, that's an interesting little point to throw in here. From Taf Reish Samach Beis, he was mishatif in every single meeting that he had. Taf Reish Samach Beis is the year of the Rebbe's birth. So to me, it seems that there's some type of connection over there. Anyway, moving forward a little bit, for the Rebbe Rashab made the shidduch between the Rebbe's father and Rebbe Elkanah, the Rebbe's mother. And for a number of years after the Chasana, he was writing, he was pashat sitting and learning, and he was writing his Torah. We'll fast forward a little bit to the Rebbe's birth. So I just called David Dubov a few minutes ago, right before I started, to make sure we got the details right, and I have some corrections to the way I've told it a couple times the last couple days. Taf Reish Samaches. The Rebbe was 6 years old. Rabbi Yitzchak Dubov, who was a Bochur in Lubavitch, came to visit Nikolaev together with his friend Reb Shmuel Grossman. And together, since they were coming from the Rebbe Rashab, they were coming from the Rebbe, they decided to pay a visit to his tremendous makusher and chassid, Reb Levi Yitzchak. So Reb Shmuel, Reb Asher Grossman, and Reb Yitzchak Dubov came to the Rebbe's home. The Rebbe was 6 years old at the time, and they saw that the Rebbe's father is sitting on a chair, and there are two boys sitting in front of him on the grass, listening. So he figured that he's probably reading him a story or something. He comes closer, and he sees that he's reading them Likutei Torah. So the Bochurim wouldn't necessarily have the chutzpah to ask, but Reb Asher, who was an older chassid, he said to him, like, you know, what are you doing exactly? So he said, "Ze verstehen, du kannst ze verhören." And that's what he did. He asked the Rebbe to repeat to him what it was, and the Rebbe chazed the whole Amud in Likutei Torah. The Rebbe says in a couple of different places that his father was his main teacher. I just noticed yesterday an interesting fact that's written in the Yiddishaim, which most of the information for those articles about the Rebbe's early life came directly from Rebbe Elkanah. He says that the Rebbe's father would sit a whole night, Friday night, and learn with the Rebbe. Stam. Yossi was saying before about, that the Rebbe's father's Torah is Kabbalah. It's a little bit over our heads, v'chulu. So I'm certainly not a makubal, Kama researcher and Kama chassid, but I should tell you that I think that when you open up Likutei Levi Yitzchak, even though it's a little bit intimidating the way the pages go straight, page after page after page, it actually can be understood Befrat with the way recently Rabbi David Dubov, Pesach Schmerling, and others have really worked to be mefaneach it, to add nekudis, to simplify it. It actually is, it is understandable to us. And the way David says it, and I can't agree more, it's a tremendous, the way the Rebbe said it on a number of occasions. The Rebbe himself spoke about his father's Torah all the time to us at Farbrengens. It is understandable, and l'chayra, it's a tremendous nachas to the Rebbe when we take the time and learn his father's Torah. Fast forward to when he became the Rav. So for quite a while, the Rebbe Rashab was pushing that he should become the Rav in a number of cities. First was Rostov, then another city. Those didn't work out exactly. And then eventually became the Rav in Dnepropetrovsk. Dnepropetrovsk was actually a very large city, a big city, and it was his first shtela. He had never been a Rav before. He was sitting at home and learning. And the Rebbe Rashab pushed that he should be there. It wasn't a simple thing. There was opposition to him. There were obviously some chassidim in the city, and they wanted him to be the Rav, but there was opposition to him as well. And just two little things that happened. So there, in the end, they made up that there would be two Rabbanim, and he became the Rav of Dnepropetrovsk along with somebody else, a Veltisher Rav as well. And Rebbe Elkanah writes how there was opposition in the beginning, but then after a while, after a short time, everybody in the city fell in love with him. And the time that she says where it was most seen, the transformation that happened, when they arrived in the city, the Rebbe was 6.5 years old. But the transformation was complete, the way the Rebbetzin writes it, Rebbe Elkanah writes it, by the Rebbe's bar mitzvah. When the entire community and all of the shulin and all the different people came, she writes in great detail about the Rebbe's bar mitzvah, but she writes that was the turning point at which it was clear to all how beloved he had become, how he cared for everybody, begashmias and beruchnis, and even though he was incredibly frum and stubborn with his frumkeit, everybody absolutely loved him. I should say, I'm not going for the basic things that certainly every chassid knows, what Rebbe Elkanah writes in her Rishimis. This is Chassidus 101, the stories of the Rebbe's childhood, of the Rebbe's father's life. This is like basic stuff. Never mind, it's fascinating, so it's easy reading. But I'm sure everybody here knows this. If you don't, please go read it. It's translated beautifully into English as well. There's many other sources. The New Toldos Levi Yitzchak for Hebrew readers, 3 volumes, absolutely fascinating. We need to, at the very least, understand and learn and read about the Rebbe's parents, the Rebbe's father, especially because it's so readily accessible. The Early Years book is not a bad place to learn some of this. There are many videos out with interviews with people. I mean, this is like the basic stuff. I'm just trying to fill in some of the interesting blanks. When did I start? I'll tell. I have. Okay, we'll tell one more story, and then maybe we'll go to after Chof Av, to some of the stories that maybe involve Chof Avs after the stalkus of the Rebbe's father. But this one story, people seem to enjoy it, so I will share a story. Okay, one other thing. So I'm going to share 2 short stories. One is that when the Rebbe was 15 or 16 years old, this story was told by Herschel Nautik's father. His name was, interesting name. Anyway, Herschel Nautik's father told the story. We don't know if it was from him himself or he heard it from somebody, but this is the story that he told. That they were in the Rebbe's father's home. He was a Bochur in Lubavitch. He came together with somebody else, and they were visiting the Rebbe's home in Dnepropetrovsk. And as they were there, the mailman came. And as Bochurim do, they were a little bit nosy, and they were looking, and they saw that the mailman brought a box and handed it to the Rebbe's father. And what do you know? They noticed that the box is from the Rebbe. It's from the Rebbe Rashab. He sent a box to Horav Levi Yitzchak of the Dnepropetrovsk. Interesting, okay. They saw him go over, and he opened the box, and inside it were some clothing. So the Bochurim started trying to figure out what's going on over here. The Rebbe sent him clothing. So they said, does the Rebbe, it was gifts, obviously. So he said, does the Rebbe send you gifts often? Again, meaning the Rebbe Rashab. So he said, from time to time, he'll send me gifts. And they're like, and do you ever send gifts back to him? So he said, I'll show you my gift to him. And he took them over to the door, and he opened it a crack, and the Rebbe was sitting there and learning. I'll fast forward to a story that happened in Tafresh Tzaddik, 1930. This is fast forwarding all the way through the communist revolution, when the persecution of religion became absolutely unbearable. All the Rabbanim were falling away like flies. Either they ran away, or they were scared away, or they were tortured away. There was nobody left. He was the only Rav left standing, obviously in Dnepropetrovsk, and pretty much in all of Ukraine, the only one Rav who was able to stand up to the communists. And in 1930, the government ordered that there be a Ve'idas HaRabbanim in Kharkov, a rabbinical conference in Kharkov. And one of the key things that they wanted is that the rabbis should all sign a proclamation stating that the government is very supportive of religion. And that had already been done by 26 or 28 Rabbanim in Belarus, and they were trying to get each of the countries, each of the provinces of the Soviet Union, that they should get a similar proclamation. And the Rebbe's father, in the end, did not sign it. He stood up to them, and in fact, they forced him to go meet the premier, the prime minister of Ukraine, whatever it was called. The prime minister then was all of the entire USSR, but the head of the entire Ukraine tried to convince him, the way they say in the archives, tried to convince him to sign it, and he wouldn't sign it. But as he was there was a group of Bochurim who were learning smicha, hiding in the Weiber shul, where it was dark, in the shul in Kharkov. There was an elder Bochur there, and he brought, the Rebbe's father was a big Rav who was in the city, brought him to faher them. And he came in, and Reb Nachum Goldschmidt, who was from Dnepropetrovsk, was there. And he, of course, knew the Rebbe's father. He was a classmate of the Rebbe's brother, Leibel. So the way he says it, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak walked into the room, and the room lit up. He had such a tzir, he had such a presence, he felt like the room lit up. Of course, he jumped up, he recognized him, and long story short, he fahered the Bochurim for a few minutes. They were learning Melicha, and he asked them some shaylas, and before long, he started explaining the entire Indian of Melicha al pi Kabbalah, what Shriya and Hadacha, Melicha and Hadacha, and what it all is al pi Kabbalah, and why the Taz holds like this and the Shach holds like this, because their Sherish and Neshama is this or that. Within 5 minutes, he lost them, and he was going on and on and on, and the Bochurim were sitting there trying to keep up and understand the way he was explaining what they were learning al pi Kabbalah. On the way out, so as he was leaving, Reb Nachum and this Elter Bochur escorted him to his hotel. Reb Nachum because he knew him, and the Elter Bochur because he was the one who had brought him to faher the Bochurim. As they walked him back to the hotel, he started telling them, Bochurim, do you know why I'm here in town? There's a Vidas HaRabbanim, and the Rabbanim and the government wants us to sign this proclamation, and we're not sure. Should we sign it, and maybe because of this they'll become more cooperative to religion, or should we oppose it because they're going to use it against us? He was going back and forth. They walked him up to his room, and he was getting more and more agitated. He sat down by the table, and he put his head in his hands, and he was back and forth. Should he do it? Should he not do it? At a certain point, they said to him, Rebbe, after Lake Tizachzu, they didn't know kind of what to do with themselves. So the Rebbe's father turned to the bed and said, I'm not going to sleep there. I don't know who slept here before. Now, the conference was 1 to 2 weeks. I'm not sure exactly how long. It was between 1 and 2 weeks. And he was staying in that hotel room. So, obviously, he was not using the bed. And Yesh Lahashves, with the story, when the Rebbe was in Paris in Tafshin Zayin visiting, there were certain Chassidim who would follow him very closely every day. And they visited him in the hotel. And they noticed that the Seforim did not move from the bed, did not move on the bed from day to day. In other words, the Rebbe didn't use the bed in the hotel either. What does this mean? Yeah or no? Okay, I'll tell you a couple stories post Chof Mendel. Just 3 minutes or 3 stories? Okay. I wasn't asked to speak about this, but there's another few stories that are post Chof Av, because there's some people, there are people who are going to help, in their minds, to help the Rebbe be Mekayim the mitzvah of Kibud Av V'Em, and visiting the Rebbe's father. So I thought it would be appropriate, and obviously that could be for the Farbrengen for later, what this is and what everybody can discuss what they think it means to the Rebbe, what it does certainly mean to the Rebbe, what place it has, v'chulu. But I just want to share a couple of little stories. In summer Tafshin Lamed Aleph, Reb Mordechai Menashe Gerelik was living in Tashkent, and the Rebbe sent a message asking that some of the Chassidim go from Tashkent to Alma-Ata to visit his father. It was an hour-and-a-half flight at the time in Russia, and they should bring along with them pictures of the Rebbe. They should say Meine Lashon there and different things that they should do. They went, and before long, most of them were suddenly let out of Russia. That following Tishrei, right after that summer, Tishrei Lamed Beis, some of these Bochurim, including this fellow, Rebbe Gerelik, came to the Rebbe. Erev Yom Kippur was the first time he saw the Rebbe. He went online in the afternoon after the bracha. The Rebbe gave out lekach, and the Rebbe stopped him and asked him who else was there and who else made it here. V'chulu, spoke to him for a couple of minutes, and he used the opportunity to ask the Rebbe for a bracha that people should get out of Russia. And he asked also for his father, and the Rebbe said, well, your father, we still need him to stay there. And obviously that sent a shiver down his back. He wanted his father to get out of Russia. Later he understood. After Sukkot, he had a yichidus with the Rebbe. And he brought to the Rebbe 10 pictures he had taken of the Rebbe's father's Ohel. And the Rebbe took the pictures in the yichidus, and he pulled out a magnifying glass, and he studied every picture for an incredibly long amount of time with the magnifying glass. And then he started asking him questions. How much space is there between the goyim around and where my father's buried? Who's buried to his right? Who's buried to his left? He started asking him all these questions, which he says 90% of them he didn't know the answer. He hadn't paid attention to this. And suddenly the Rebbe turned and he looked out the window, and he said immediately he felt the Rebbe wasn't here anymore. He was suddenly looking out the window, and the Rebbe said to him, "Was hältst du? Wollt man gekannt bringen dem Taten daher zu?" Is there a precedent for this? Would it be kedai to make an international thing out of this between countries, to use diplomacy to try and make this happen? And he says, like, what's he supposed to answer? He's a Bochur standing there. And the Rebbe was quiet for a long time, and he said, "Zol shem bleiben mazoi." David Nachshon, when he went to restore the Ohelim of the Rabbeim, so the Rebbe gave, he came back, he informed about Nezhin and Hadich and all these places, and the Rebbe gave him a nice, a bracha for each of them. When he came back with the key to the Ohel in Alma-Ata, immediately Rabbi Groner came running back out and said, the Rebbe wants you to give him the key himself. And he walked into Gan Eden Elyon, the Staf Shinun Aleph, and he started handing the Rebbe the key, and he said, the Rebbe said, "Das ist the Schlüssel zum Ohel." And he said, "Das ist the Rebbe's Taten's Kaver." The Rebbe said again, "Das ist the Schlüssel zum Ohel." And he said, "Yeah." And he gave it to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe started giving him brachas, pouring brachas on him for what he had done, for taking care of his father's Ohel. One other thing that I just learned today that was brought to my attention, sorry, in Chof Av Tafshin Yudalid, the Rebbe speaks about how it says in Achreinim that somebody who didn't go to the kaver of his father for 10 years after his istalkus shouldn't go anymore. And there's another shitta that it's 7 years. And it's then the shai. In the Sikh it says Isa B'Achreinim, but it's Tzavas Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. I don't know if that's a stira or not, but so. And then the Rebbe says, but how could it be? Kalev went lishtateach al kivrei avis, and he had never been. The answer is that he Pasha wasn't able to. That other people give an answer that he Pasha wasn't able to go, and that's why he was able to go later. And the Rebbe also spoke about this in Tafshin Yud Aleph, which was 7 years. So 7 years and 10 years from the Rebbe's father's istalkus, he brought this up. So the chiluk is whether it's ba'inus or baratzin. And one last thing. In the the Rebbe started mentioning in the Michtavim HaKlalim, just another interesting fact I learned today. In every Michtav Klali, the Rebbe mentions each of the Rabbeim, starting from Tafshin Lamed Aleph. Tafshin Lamed Aleph is when the Rebbe's father's Torah came out, and he also mentions his father every single time. And the same thing is from Tafshin Lamed Aleph and on, in every Basi Lagani, from when his father's Torah first came out, the Rebbe mentions also his father. And in a Michtav, in Tafshin Chai, the Rebbe writes, before his father, the title, Chvei Kedushas Amur. So I'm sure that the Farbrengen that we're having now, and all of the learning from the Torah of the Rebbe's father, and all of the sharing the different stories, and learning about the life of the Rebbe's father, and what he meant and means to the Rebbe, and to all of us, is certainly Geirim a lot of Nachas Ruach to the Rebbe. Yiratzen that we should continue to be Geirim more and more Nachas Ruach to the Rebbe, and to be reunited with the Rebbe, the Gashmias, take off of Miyad Mamish. L'chaim.